6 months after the invasion began, and Commander Yethrix sat on the bridge of the inexorable Truth and watched the human reinforcement fleet enter weapons range. And he gave the order to intercept with a weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. The Velthri battle groups moved to engage, and their warships were faster and stronger and better armed than anything the humans had brought. And the mathematics of the encounter should have predicted a swift and decisive Velthri victory. The mathematics were wrong. Yethrix watched in disbelief as civilian cargo ships accelerated directly into the guns of his destroyers, and their crews made no attempt to evade or survive. And they simply drove their vessels forward until they exploded against Velthri hulls and created openings for the ships behind them. "They are sacrificing themselves," Maradak said, and his voice was hollow with shock. "And they are dying to create tactical advantages for vessels that will also die. And this is not warfare, and this is something else entirely." Yethrix understood what it was because he had spent 6 months learning to understand humans in ways he had never understood any enemy. Before was devotion. These humans had traveled across the stars, knowing they would probably die. And they had come anyway because somewhere on the planet below, other humans were fighting and suffering and refusing to surrender. And that was enough reason for them to give everything. They had the battle in orbit had barely begun when the reports started coming from the surface. Commander, his ground operations officer, reported with panic bleeding through his professional composure. "We are experiencing coordinated uprisings across all occupied territories, and the timing is simultaneous to the second. And humans who showed no resistance for months have revealed themselves as embedded operatives, and they are attacking from inside our positions." Yethrix closed his eyes for a moment and understood that this was not a coincidence, and this was not luck. The humans had planned this for months, and they had placed their people inside Velthri operations, and they had waited with impossible patience for exactly the right moment to strike. And that moment was now. He thought about all the human workers who had served in Velthri facilities and all the translators who had helped with communications and all the laborers who had been deemed too useful to intern. And he realized that every one of them had been a weapon waiting to be used. "How many?" he asked quietly. "Commander, how many of our facilities are under attack?" The operations officer checked his displays, and his scales went pale with horror. "All of them, Commander, and I mean all of them. And every supply depot and communication center and command post on all 3 continents is reporting simultaneous assault." Yethrix opened his eyes and looked at the tactical display where his orbital forces were being torn apart by a fleet of converted cargo ships crewed by people who considered their lives an acceptable price for victory. He looked at the surface displays where 6 months of careful occupation were collapsing in a matter of hours, and finally, after 200 years of military service and 47 conquered worlds and absolute certainty in the inevitability of Velthri dominance, Commander Yethrix understood the truth that had been staring him in the face since Ambassador Sio delivered her refusal on the first day. The Velthri fought because they had to. War was a tool they used to expand their empire and secure their resources and maintain their dominance over lesser species. Humans fought because they could. War was not a tool for them, but a part of who they were. Something woven into their blood and bones in history. Something they treated as a craft to be mastered, and an art to be perfected, and a terrible necessity to be embraced when all other options failed. And in that difference lay the truth that Yethrix could no longer deny. To defeat humans, you would have to become something worse than them, and if you became that thing, you would have already lost everything that made victory meaningful. He turned to Meridax and spoke the words that no Velthari commander had ever spoken in the history of the Dominion. Order all forces to withdraw from New Hanzhou and signal the fleet to break off engagement and prepare for departure. Meridax stared at him with disbelief that slowly transformed into something that might have been relief. Commander, the High Command authorized planetary sterilization, and they will not accept a withdrawal without. I know what they authorized, Yethrix interrupted. And I know what they will say when they receive my report, and I do not care. Because I will not spend Velthari lives trying to destroy a species that cannot be destroyed by any means we are willing to use. The withdrawal order went out, and Velthari forces began their retreat from the surface, and the orbital fleet disengaged from the human ships that had been throwing themselves into destruction. Yethrix composed his final assessment as his flagship moved away from New Hanzhou, and he chose his words carefully because he knew they would be read by the High Command and probably used as evidence at his trial for disobedience. The humans allowed the withdrawal to proceed, and no pursuing ships harassed his fleet, and no final strikes targeted his retreating ground forces instead. A single transmission came from the surface. And it was from Ambassador Sao Himin, whose calm refusal had started all of this 6 months ago. Commander Yethrix, she said, and her voice was tired, but steady in the way of someone who had endured something terrible and emerged on the other side. We accept your departure, and we will remember your arrival. Yethrix watched New Hanzhou shrink in the view screen as his fleet accelerated toward the jump point that would take them back to Dominion space. And he thought about those words and what they meant. The humans would remember. They would remember the invasion, and the occupation and the deaths and the destruction. And they would add this memory to all the other memories they carried in their collective history. And they would use those memories to prepare for the next time someone underestimated them, and there would be no revenge. And there would be no pursuit. And there would be no continued war unless the Velthari chose to continue it. Because humans did not fight for conquest or glory or expansion. Humans fought to survive. And when the threat to their survival ended, they stopped fighting and went back to building cities and raising children and hoping for quiet lives until the next time someone made the mistake of threatening them. Yethrix completed his report and transmitted it to High Command. And the final paragraph contained the assessment that he knew would end his career and possibly his life. Recommendation: the Velthari Stellar Dominion should classify humanity as a species to be avoided rather than conquered. And all future contact should be conducted through diplomatic channels with extreme caution. And any military action against human worlds should be considered only as a last resort, and only with the understanding that victory may not be possible regardless of the resources committed. He added one final observation that he suspected the High Command would not understand, but that he needed to write. Anyway, we did not lose because we were weak. And we did not lose because humans were stronger. And we lost because we woke something that humanity had spent centuries trying to put to sleep. And that something is a capacity for violence so deeply integrated into their nature that they built entire civilizations around containing it. And when we made them remember what they were capable of, we created an enemy that we were never prepared to face. Commander Yethrix watched the stars streak past as his fleet fled from a world that should have been easy conquest. And he thought about everything he had believed. About war before he met humanity. He had thought that war was about numbers and technology and strategy, and he had thought that sufficient force could overcome any resistance, and that victory went to the strong, and that the weak eventually accepted their place. He had thought he understood war. He was wrong war, as he knew it was a tool used by species that considered violence a means to an end. What humans possessed was something older and more terrible. It was a heritage of endless struggle written into every cell of their bodies and every story of their history and every dream of their children. And now that heritage was awake and watching and remembering. And Commander Yethrix understood that the galaxy would never be quite the same again. 3 months into the occupation, and Commander Yethrix had learned to divide time in a way he had never done before on any of his 47 conquered worlds during the daylight hours. The Velthari controlled the major cities, and their soldiers patrolled the streets, and their flags flew from government buildings, and their officers issued orders that the human population appeared to obey. During the night hours, something else controlled New Hanzhou, and Velthari patrols vanished without a trace, and supply depots exploded in flames, and soldiers woke to find their commanding officers dead in their beds with no sign of how the killers had entered or escaped. Yethrix had stopped sleeping in the traditional sense, and instead he took short naps at irregular intervals because the humans had demonstrated an ability to predict Velthari schedules that bordered on supernatural, and he had learned that the only defense against their precision was chaos and unpredictability. He stood on the bridge of the inexorable truth and reviewed the latest intelligence reports, and what he saw filled him with a frustration that has slowly transformed into something closer to admiration. The humans were adapting faster than any species he had ever encountered. Tactics that had worked brilliantly last week failed completely today, and weaknesses that his forces had exploited once were never exploitable again. And it was as if every human on the planet was connected to some vast invisible network that shared knowledge and experience instantaneously. They learned from every engagement, Maradak said, as he pointed to patterns in the data that Yethrix had already noticed. And not just the survivors, but all of them. And when one unit discovers a Velthari weakness, that information spreads across the entire planet within hours. Yethrix nodded slowly, because he had seen this phenomenon in action. A new Velthari weapon system had been deployed in the northern continent last month, and within 3 days, the humans in the southern continent had already developed countermeasures. And within a week, those countermeasures had been refined and improved and distributed to every resistance cell on the planet. It is not just their learning speed that concerns me, Yethrix said, and his voice was heavy with a weariness that had seeped into his bones over the past weeks, because they have begun to target things that make no military sense. He pulled up a list of recent human strikes and pointed to entries that had puzzled his analysts. A commander's personal transport had been destroyed while he was attending a strategy meeting, and the transport had been empty and had no military value. But the commander had owned that vehicle for 30 years and had considered it a good luck charm. A medical station's patient files had been deleted by a cyberattack that had left all the medical equipment functional, and the attack had served no strategic purpose, but it had destroyed the records of soldiers who had been saved and healed and returned to duty. A memorial to Velthari fallen soldiers had been vandalized with human symbols and messages, and the memorial had been purely ceremonial. But its destruction had caused an emotional reaction among the troops that was far worse than losing an actual military asset. They are not attacking our strength, Yethrix realized as he spoke the words aloud, and they are attacking our spirit, and they understand that an army is more than weapons and soldiers. And an army is also morale and confidence and the belief that victory is possible. The door to the bridge opened and the ship's medical officer entered with a report that made Yethrix's heart sink even further. Commander, I must inform you that we're seeing increasing cases of what the humans call combat fatigue among our ground forces. And the symptoms include difficulty sleeping and heightened anxiety and decreased combat effectiveness, and in some cases complete psychological breakdown. Yethrix stared at the medical officer with disbelief, because the Velthari had no word for this condition, and they had never needed one in all their centuries of conquest. Our warriors are the finest in the galaxy, he said, and they have fought on dozens of worlds without experiencing these problems. The medical officer shifted uncomfortably, and his scale showed the gray tones of reluctant disagreement. Commander, on those other worlds, our warriors faced enemies who surrendered after sufficient pressure was applied. And they faced enemies who followed predictable patterns and fought according to rules we could understand. And they faced enemies who wanted to survive. He paused and looked at the data on his tablet. The humans do not behave like any enemy we have faced before. And our warriors do not know how to process an enemy that appears from nowhere and kills without warning and vanishes without explanation. And they do not know how to fight an enemy that includes grandmothers and children and farmers and teachers. And they do not know how to sleep when they understand that nowhere is safe and no one can be trusted. A communication alert interrupted them, and Meridax's voice was tight with controlled alarm as he reported, "Commander, we are receiving a transmission from the direction of human space, and our sensors indicate a fleet of approximately 200 vessels approaching New Hongo." Yethrix moved to the tactical display and felt hope surge in his chest because reinforcements from the Dominion could turn the tide of this bloody stalemate. Then Meridax continued speaking, and that hope died. "Commander, the vessels are not Velthari, and they are human. And our analysis indicates they are a mix of colony ships and cargo, haulers and civilian transports that have been retrofitted with weapon systems." Yethrix studied the approaching fleet and saw that Meridax was correct. And the ships were a ragged collection of non-military vessels that should have posed no threat to his battle groups. And yet something about their approach filled him with dread. "They are coming from 12 different human systems," Meridax added quietly, "and our intelligence indicates they were not ordered to come. And they were not conscripted or drafted or commanded. And they simply chose to come because they heard that humans on New Hanjo were fighting for their survival." Yethrix thought about the implications of that statement and felt the cold stone in his chest grow heavier still. On Velthari world, soldiers fought because they were ordered to fight. And civilians supported the war because they were required to support the war. And everyone did their duty because duty was what held the Dominion together. These humans were crossing the vastness of space in ships, not designed for combat because they wanted to, because somewhere deep in their strange and terrible hearts they felt a connection to humans they had never met on a world they had never visited. He accessed the Dominion's historical archives and searched for any record of any species behaving in this way. And he searched through thousands of years of conquest and hundreds of subjugated worlds. He found nothing. No species had ever voluntarily joined a fight that was not their own. And no species had ever crossed interstellar distances to die alongside strangers, simply because those strangers shared their blood. Except humans. A priority communication alert flashed across his display, and Yethrix saw that it was from Dominion High Command. And he accepted the transmission with a feeling of resignation that had become familiar over the past weeks. The face of High Admiral Vorthax appeared on the screen, and his expression was cold and calculating, in the way of commanders who had never seen ground combat, and who made decisions based on reports and statistics, rather than the reality of blood and death. "Commander Yethrix," Vorthax said, "your campaign has exceeded all projected timelines and all acceptable casualty rates. And the High Command has determined that conventional victory is no longer achievable within acceptable parameters." Yethrix said nothing because he had known this communication was coming, and he had dreaded it and hoped for it in equal measure. "You are hereby authorized to implement planetary sterilization protocols," Vorthax continued, "and you will eliminate all human life on New Honjo, and you will destroy all infrastructure, and you will render the planet uninhabitable for future colonization." The transmission ended and Yethrix sat in his command chair and stared at the order that would kill millions of humans. And in this nightmare, once and for all, his hand moved toward the console that would authorize the bombardment, and his finger hovered over the command key, and then he stopped. He looked at the human fleet approaching through the darkness of space. Those fragile ships full of civilians who had chosen to die rather than abandon their own kind. He thought about Captain Bay and his calm certainty and his warning about what humans were capable of when they remembered their true nature. He thought about the grandmother who had walked into that supply depot without hesitation, and the children in the sewers, and the farmers with their improvised weapons, and he wondered, for the first time in his long career, if even total destruction would be enough to stop them. 6 weeks had passed since the invasion began, and Commander Yethrix had requested and received 4 additional battle groups from the Dominion High Command. And still the humans refused to break. And still the casualty reports grew longer with each passing day. The conflict had spread beyond Chengshin to every major city on all 3 continents of New Hanzhou. And Yethrix had learned to recognize a pattern that he had been too confident to see in those first terrible days. Other species fought to survive. And when survival became impossible, they surrendered, because surrender was the rational choice. Humans fought to win. And the distinction was everything. He stood in the interrogation chamber of the inexorable truth and watched the guards bring in a human prisoner. And he had ordered this meeting because he needed to understand his enemy and his intelligence. Reports had failed him, and his officers had no answers, and his own experience was useless against this strange and terrible foe. The human was male and young by their standards, perhaps 30 years of age, and he wore the torn remnants of a military uniform with insignia that identified him as Captain Bei Suho of the New Hanzhou Defense Force. And he had been captured during a raid on a Velthari supply convoy that had killed over 200 warriors before the humans melted back into the civilian population. Yethrix expected to see fear in the humans' eyes, because every prisoner he had ever interrogated had shown fear when they stood before him and realized the hopelessness of their situation. Instead, Captain Bay studied him with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, and his eyes moved across Yethrix's face and armor, and the decorations that marked his rank, with the careful attention of someone trying to understand something new and interesting. "You are Commander Yethrix," the human said in accented Velthari that he had somehow learned during his captivity. "And you are the one who ordered the invasion. And you are the one who thought this would be over in 6 hours." Yethrix felt anger flare in his chest, but he pushed it down because anger was a weakness, and weakness was something he could not afford to show. "I am Commander Yethrix," he confirmed, "and I have brought you here because I wish to understand your species. And I believe that understanding will help me finish this war more quickly." Captain Bay smiled, and it was not the desperate smile of a prisoner trying to bargain for his life. And it was instead the patient smile of a teacher about to deliver a lesson. "Ask your questions, Commander, and I will answer them honestly, because the answers will not help you, and because I think you need to hear them." Yethrix circled the human slowly and tried to read his body language for signs of deception or fear. But the human remained calm, and his heartbeat stayed steady, and his eyes followed Yethrix with that same curious expression. "Your forces are outnumbered and outgunned," Yethrix said. "And your cities are burning, and your people are dying by the thousands, and yet you continue to fight. And I want to know why you do not surrender when surrender would save so many of your people." Captain Bay was quiet for a long moment, and then he spoke in a voice that was soft and calm and somehow more frightening than any battle cry Yethrix had ever heard. "Commander, do you know what total war means?" Yethrix searched his memory, and found the term in the human history files he had studied. But the definition had seemed abstract and theoretical. "It is a concept from your species' past conflicts," he said. "And it refers to wars where all resources of a society are devoted to the war effort." Captain Bay nodded slowly, and his smile faded into something more serious. "That is part of it," he said. "But total war is more than just logistics and resource allocation. And it is a way of thinking that my species invented during our darkest periods. And it is something we swore we would never use again because it frightened even us." He leaned forward and his eyes locked onto Yethrix's with an intensity that made the commander want to step back. "Total war means that there are no civilians and no rules and no limits. And it means that every man and woman and child becomes a weapon and every building becomes a fortress and every street becomes a killing ground. And it means that we do not stop fighting until one side is completely destroyed or completely victorious." Yethrix forced himself to hold the human's gaze and to show no sign of the unease growing in his chest. "You speak of something terrible," he said, "but your species banned this practice. And your current forces are clearly operating under rules and limitations." Captain Bay's smile returned, and this time it held no warmth at all. "We banned it because we chose to," he said. "And we limited ourselves because we chose to. And we fought with rules because we chose to. But you should understand something very important. Commander." He paused, and the silence stretched between them like a physical thing. "You have given us permission to remember." Yethrix left the interrogation chamber with more questions than answers, and he returned to his bridge and tried to focus on tactical matters. But the human's words echoed in his mind like a warning he could not ignore. 3 hours later, his warning came true. 3 Velthari supply ships in orbit exploded simultaneously, and the weapons that destroyed them did not match any technology in the intelligence databases. And when the debris was analyzed, his scientists reported that the humans had somehow built weapons from salvaged Velthari, technology that they had recovered from crashed dropships and destroyed vehicles. "This is impossible," Maradak said as he reviewed the analysis, "because this technology was captured less than 4 weeks ago, and it would take our own engineers months to reverse engineer unfamiliar systems." Yethrix stared at the report and felt the cold stone in his chest grow heavier as understanding finally began to dawn. "They did not need months," he said quietly, "because they are not trying to understand the technology completely, and they are simply trying to make it work well enough to kill us." He walked to the observation deck and looked down at the world below, and he saw the fires burning in the cities and the smoke rising from the battlefields. And he realized with horrible clarity that he was not fighting the humans who had existed before his invasion. Those humans had been peaceful colonists who built cities and farmed land and raised children and hoped for quiet lives on their new world. Those humans were gone now, and their place was something older and darker, something that his invasion had awakened from a sleep of centuries, something that humanity had tried to bury deep within itself but had never truly destroyed. He was fighting the humans who had survived ice ages and plagues and wars beyond counting. The humans who had clawed their way up from nothing and spread across a galaxy despite every obstacle. The humans who carried within their genes the memory of 10,000 years of struggle and survival and victory against impossible odds, and they were just getting started. Captain Bay's words returned to him with new and terrible meaning, and Yethrix understood at last what the human had been trying to tell him. The Velthari had not invaded a peaceful world. They had poked a sleeping monster, and now that monster was opening its eyes and stretching its claws and remembering all the terrible things it was capable of, and somewhere deep in Commander Yethrix's ancient warrior's heart, something he had never felt before began to stir. It took him a moment to recognize it because he had never experienced it in 200 years of conquest. It was doubt. 72 hours had passed since the first Valkyrie boots touched the soil of New Hongo, and Commander Yethrix stood before his tactical display with a feeling he had not experienced in over a century of warfare. The feeling was confusion, and it sat in his chest like a stone that grew heavier with each report that came from the surface below. "Explain this to me again," he said to Meridax, and his voice was flat and controlled even as his mind raced to understand what he was seeing. "Because the numbers you are showing me do not make sense." Meridax shifted uncomfortably, and his scales rippled with the gray tones of embarrassment as he gestured toward the display where casualty reports scrolled in endless streams of data. "Commander, our forces have sustained losses exceeding 12,000 warriors in the past 3 days. And this number is greater than our total casualties from the previous 4 planetary conquests combined. And the human defenders have not surrendered a single major position, despite our overwhelming numerical and technological advantage." Yethrix stared at the numbers and tried to find the error in the calculations. But the numbers were correct, and the numbers told a story that he did not want to believe. His projected 6-hour pacification had stretched into its 3rd day with no end in sight. And the capital city of Changshin had become a maze of death where Valkyrie soldiers entered and often did not return. And his commanders on the ground were sending reports that read more like horror stories than military assessments. "The humans do not fight like other species," Meridax continued, and his voice dropped to almost a whisper as if he was afraid to speak the words aloud. "And our officers report that there is no central command structure to target. And when we eliminate one group of defenders, another emerges from somewhere else. And the civilian population appears to be indistinguishable from the military forces." Yethrix had received field reports that described things he could not reconcile with his understanding of how conquered peoples behaved. And he had read about a grandmother who had walked into a supply depot with explosives strapped beneath her clothing and detonated herself without hesitation or fear. And he had read about children as young as 10 years old carrying intelligence through sewer systems, while his soldiers searched for them above. And he had read about farmers who had surrendered their weapons as ordered, and then built new weapons from farming equipment, and machine parts and anything else they could find. These were not the actions of a species that wanted to survive. And Yethrix could not understand why humans were throwing away their lives in a battle they could not possibly win. A communication alert chimed across the bridge, and Meridax's scales went pale as he read the identification codes. "Commander, it is Lieutenant Corvith requesting emergency communication, and he is using priority encryption protocols." Yethrix felt something cold grip his heart because Corvith was his most experienced ground commander with 80 years of planetary assault operations and a reputation for calm efficiency that had never wavered in any situation. And if Corvith was requesting emergency communication, then something had gone terribly wrong. "Put him through," Yethrix commanded. And the display flickered to show Corvith's face covered in dust and what looked like blue Valkyrie blood. "Commander Yethrix," Corvith said, and his voice carried something that Yethrix had never heard from a Valkyrie soldier in all his years of service. And that something was uncertainty. "I am requesting immediate extraction for my battalion from Sector 7 of Changshin. And I am requesting this because we cannot hold our position, and we cannot advance, and we cannot understand what we are fighting." Yethrix leaned forward in his chair, and his eyes narrowed as he studied his lieutenant's face through the display. "Explain yourself." "Corvith, because I have given you sufficient forces to hold that sector against anything the humans can throw at you." Corvith laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound, and it made the scales on Yethrix's neck rise with instinctive Alarm. Commander. I had 3,000 warriors under my command this morning, and now I have fewer than 800. And the humans have not attacked us with superior numbers or superior weapons. And instead they have attacked us with something I do not have words to describe. He paused and looked over his shoulder at something off-screen, and when he turned back his eyes were wide with an emotion that Yethrix realized with shock was fear. They come from everywhere and nowhere. Commander, and they strike and vanish and strike again before we can respond. And they know our patrol routes before we walk them, and they know our supply schedules before we announce them, and they know exactly where to hit us to cause the most damage with the least effort. Yethrix made his decision with the cold calculation that had served him well through 47 conquests. Request denied, he said. And his voice was hard and certain, even as doubt gnawed at the edges of his confidence. And you will hold your position, and I will send reinforcements to support your operations. And you will remember that the Volturi do not retreat from primitives with improvised weapons. Corvith stared at him through the display for a long moment, and then nodded slowly. Understood. Commander, and I will hold as long as I am able. And I hope that the reinforcements arrive before. The transmission cut to static, and Yethrix waited for it to resume, but the connection remained dead, and when he ordered technicians to re-establish contact, they reported that Corvith's communication equipment was no longer broadcasting. Yethrix sent scouts to Corvith's position, and they arrived 4 hours later, and what they found made them speak in hushed voices when they reported back to the command ship. The entire battalion had been eliminated down to the last soldier, and the humans had not taken prisoners or looted supplies or done any of the things that a sensible military force would do after a victory. And instead they had simply killed every Velthari they found, and then vanished back into the city like water. Into sand. Yethrix sat alone in his quarters that night, and he did something he had not done since he was a young officer on his first campaign. He studied human history with the desperate focus of someone searching for understanding in a universe that had suddenly become strange and unpredictable. What he found did not comfort him. He read about human conflicts with names like World War and Total War and Guerrilla War. And he read about sieges that lasted years, and wars that lasted decades, and hatreds that lasted centuries. And he read about a species that had spent its entire existence fighting itself with a creativity and persistence that no other known species had ever demonstrated. And somehow, despite all that fighting, the humans still existed, and they had spread to the stars, and they had built colonies like New Hongo. And Yethrix began to understand that he was not facing a species that fought because they were cornered. He was facing a species that had been forged in the fires of endless conflict. And war was not something terrible that happened to them. And war was something they carried within themselves, like a second heartbeat that never stopped. He closed the files and stared at the wall of his quarters, and for the first time in 200 years of military service, Commander Yethrix of the Velthari Stellar Dominion did not know what to do next. Commander Yethrix sat at the observation deck of the inexorable Truth and watched the blue and green world spinning slowly beneath him, and he felt nothing but certainty about what would happen next. He had done this 47 times before on 47 different worlds, and each time the pattern remained the same, and each time the outcome never changed. And each time another species learned that resistance against the Velthari Stellar Dominion was not just futile, but foolish beyond measure. The humans called this world New Hongo, and they had built their cities across its 3 major continents with the desperate speed of a young species reaching for the stars. And Yethrix found something almost admirable in their ambition, even as he prepared to crush it beneath his heel. Commander, his tactical officer Meridax said from across the bridge, the human government has received our transmission, and they are preparing a response. Yethrix turned his 4 eyes toward the main display screen where data streams painted pictures of human military deployments and civilian population centers and infrastructure networks that his forces would soon control. And he allowed himself a thin smile that showed none of his teeth. "Let them respond," he said, and his voice carried the weight of 200 years of military experience and 47 conquered worlds and absolute confidence in the inevitable outcome of this encounter. The terms he had transmitted were generous by Veltari standards, and he had given the humans 6 hours to surrender their planetary government and military forces and accept incorporation into the Dominion. And in exchange, he would spare their civilian population centers from orbital bombardment. It was more than he had offered the Krethiks or the Morvani or the Suluk. And all 3 of those species had eventually accepted similar terms after watching their first cities burn. And Yethrix saw no reason why humans would prove any different from the dozens of species that had knelt before Veltari. Might he had reviewed the intelligence reports on humanity with the thoroughness that had made him the Dominion's most successful conquest commander. And what he found gave him no cause for concern whatsoever. Humans were short-lived creatures who rarely survived beyond a single century, and their bodies were fragile constructions of soft tissue and brittle bone that required constant maintenance and careful environmental conditions just to function. And their technology lagged behind Veltari development by at least 200 years. Their military forces on New Hanzhou numbered perhaps 50,000 trained soldiers with equipment that his analysts rated as adequate for internal security operations but completely insufficient for repelling a proper invasion. And against those 50,000, he had brought 700,000 Veltari warriors armed with weapons that could reduce cities to ash and armor that could shrug off anything the humans possessed. The numbers told a simple story, and Yethrix had learned long ago to trust the numbers because the numbers never lied, and the numbers always predicted the outcome with perfect accuracy. "Commander," Maradax announced, "we are receiving the human response, and it is coming from their ambassador Seo Himan." "Display it," Yethrix commanded, and he settled into his command chair with the patient confidence of someone who already knew what he would hear. The display screen flickered and then showed a human female with dark hair pulled back from her face and eyes that held an expression Yethrix could not quite read. And she sat at a simple desk with the flag of New Hanzhou displayed behind her, and she looked directly into the camera as if she could somehow see through it to where Yethrix sat watching. "Commander Yethrix of the Veltari Stellar Dominion," she began, and her voice was calm and measured in a way that Yethrix found mildly surprising. "I have received your terms, and I have consulted with our government and our military leadership and our civilian population, and I am authorized to deliver our response." She paused for a moment, and something shifted in her expression, and Yethrix thought he saw the ghost of something that might have been sadness, or might have been pity, or might have been something else entirely. "We decline your generous offer," she continued, "and we do so not because we believe we can defeat you in conventional combat, and not because we think our technology can match yours, and not because we underestimate the strength of your forces or the determination of your empire." Yethrix felt his confidence waver for just a moment before he reasserted control over his thoughts, because these were not the words of desperate defiance he had expected to hear, and there was something in the human's voice that he could not quite understand. "We decline," Ambassador Seo said, "because you do not understand what you are asking, and because we cannot give you what you want, even if we wish to, and because surrender is not something humans do well, and because we have learned through long and bloody experience that the only way to survive is to make the cost of our destruction greater than any invader is willing to pay." She leaned forward slightly, and her eyes seemed to bore through the screen with an intensity that made Yethrix uncomfortable for reasons he could not name. "You have conquered 47 worlds, Commander, and I have read the records of each conquest. And I know that you have never faced anything like what you are about to face. And I tell you this not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact that I hope you will remember in the days to come." The transmission ended, and the screen returned to its tactical display. And Yethrix sat in silence for a long moment while his officers waited for his response. "Brave words," he finally said. And he forced confidence back into his voice, even as something small and cold began to grow in the back of his mind. "But words cannot stop orbital bombardment, and words cannot defeat 700,000 warriors, and words cannot change the simple mathematics of this situation." He stood from his command chair and walked to the tactical display and began issuing orders with the practiced efficiency of a commander who had done this many times before. "Begin the landing operations," he commanded, "and deploy the first wave to secure the capital city of Changshin. And I want this world pacified within 6 hours, and I want the human government brought before me in chains by nightfall." His officers moved to obey with the crisp discipline he expected. And within minutes, the first dropships began their descent toward the human world below. And Yethrix watched them fall like rain through the atmosphere, and he felt the certainty returning to his hearts. He had heard brave words before from the Krethiks and the Morvani and the Suluk, and all of them had knelt eventually, and all of them had learned that the Volturi were unstoppable. And all of them had accepted their place in the Dominion's great design. Humans would be no different, he told himself. And he began composing his victory report in his mind, even as his forces entered the atmosphere of New Hanzhou far below on the surface of that world. In the streets of Changshin, and the farms of the outer provinces, and the factories of the industrial zones, something stirred that Yethrix could not see, and could not understand, and could not have predicted with all his intelligence reports, and all his experience, and all his certainty. The humans had received the Volturi terms, and they had given their answer. And now they were preparing to give another kind of answer that would be written, not in words, but in blood and fire and a fury that Yethrix had never encountered in all his years of conquest, but he did not know this yet. And so he stood on his bridge and watched his forces descend and waited for the victory that he believed was inevitable. And he had no way of knowing that everything he thought he understood about war was about to change forever